transition period, for instance, like Indonesia, moving from undemocratic country to be a more democratic country, there are so many changes happen. Chaos is expected. Uncertainty is obvious. Gender issues tend to be left behind. Indonesia has been severely hit by the 1997 global economic crisis, and the crisis has forced Suharto, the president at the time, and his regime, the New Order regime, collapsed. Indonesia then has to undergo substantial reconstruction of its state's management structure. This marked the era of reformasi, or the reform era in Indonesia. Following these changes, institutionalization of citizen involvement in public affairs is also stronger. A new character of women's movement also emerged, starting in the end of the New Order regime. During the New Order regime, the women movement, to a certain degree, can be considered as strengthening the gender inequality. That's because at the time, the state gender ideology make it impossible for women movement to have an independent movement. During the New Order, the women's movement concentrated on satisfying what we call practical gender needs and supported the state to achieve its target of development and stability. In the late New Order, women's organizations started to question asymmetrical gender relations. In the beginning of reformasi, strategic gender interests were the focus and priority of women's movement. MPR is the People Consultative Assembly in Indonesia. Increased popular participation in Indonesia now is driven by the amendments of the Indonesian constitution at the beginning of reformasi, shaping new relationships among the state institutions, including MPR. The first amendment in 1999 put in place substantial reform of the MPR in two ways. First is the membership of MPR, and then the second one is the authority of the MPR. These two aspects are crucial in cementing a new configurations of political power and relationship among the state bodies. And this is the basis for reviewing the contemporary management of development in Indonesia. Prior to the amendment, MPR consisted of 1,000 members. Almost half of the members, 140 people, were assigned by the president. The powers of MPR were fundamentally revised. Previously, MPR is the supreme institution of the Indonesian state in representing people's sovereignty. MPR has the authority to amend the constitutions, establish the broad outlines of the state policy, or we refer it as GBHN, and also to elect the presidents. Indonesia now is implementing stronger public participation, both direct and indirect participations. Now it's not only president that is elected through direct elections. Local leader at provincial, district, and also municipality level now is elected through direct elections. Public participations mean that those who will be affected by policy, the policy or the program, are involved in making the decisions that will affect their life. They also involved in the implementations level and also involved in monitoring and evaluate the implementations of policy or the program. Also, the government now has to inform the budget and get critics or questions or challenging from the community. Considering these substantial changes, how the public, in particular at the grassroots, responded? Rural poverty needs special attention because it is less visible compared to the urban poverty. So women tended to marry at younger age in rural areas. Percentage of women attending school were lower, illiteracy rate was much higher, and there was more female unemployment than male unemployment. In terms of Human Development Index, both Sudan and Indonesia are in the same category of medium human development nations. Now, if we look at the Gender Development Index, We can see that both in Indonesia and in Sudan, women has lower score. In terms of income, the figure is also a warning. In Indonesia, men's income is about twice higher than women. But for Sudan, men's income is 5 times higher than women. Sudan has about 16% women sitting in the parliament, while Indonesia only have about 11%. Apparently, it is more difficult for the rural people, women and the poor, in particular, to involve in public deliberations or consultations. It's a kind of very difficult for those who are illiterate, who can't read, or have a little exposed to political issue and debate, to make sure that they do not choose the wrong party that they want. Extensive trainings, explanations, simulations were conducted to enable the public to join the elections and did the vote correctly. Extensive information to the community, how to do it properly, how to do it in the right way. As Indonesia moving from indirect participations to more direct participations and trying to make it as inclusive as possible to make sure that those who usually excluded in the process definitely is not easy. Finding key persons, not always associated with high-rank profile, can help. In the case of Indonesia, when the regional autonomy stipulated, there are several cases when local government produce local regulations that discriminate women, stereotype women, and of course, this is what we consider a setback of the achievement of the situations for women's gender equality. Legislation is one of the instruments that is very important to be there. But regulation in itself is not sufficient. There are many factors that contribute to the success of the implementations of mainstreaming gender policy. In the case of Indonesia, Indonesia already stipulated mainstreaming gender policy in 2000. But looking at the reality, it's still far away, still far from satisfying. The continuous raising awareness, education, and promotion of the value is necessary, as it is not easy to challenge the existing gender ideology that has been rooted in the society. Challenging the existing gender constructions means also that you have to challenge the existing practices, traditions, belief, values, and religious belief. That definitely is not easy. Promoting gender perspective might cause conflict and pros and cons. It's not the case when we talk, for instance, about economic development. No one will debate that we need a better economy.
It is not the multiplicity of languages that causes people to fight or to quarrel. People may argue and quarrel over language issues, but that's not the issue that causes people to fight eventually. Rather, the legitimate and pertinent issue at stake is about struggles over resources, access to political power, and control of state. These are the issues that are at the core of the kind of arguments or quarrels that you find. When people then talk about languages as being divisive, this is a situation where certain political elements, people aspiring for political power, and they are trying to gain mileage, then they manipulate people who speak different languages and deploy them to fight. But this is really an issue about control of resources. We know most, in fact, all African countries emerged out of colonialism, and Sudan, I know, has several hundreds of languages. So when they emerge out of colonialism, the tendency is to adopt one or either of the two. The first one is, when it comes to language policy, they adopt big languages which are selected, promoted, and imposed as languages of the state. The other approach, the popular one, which is there, is the adoption of ex-colonial languages which are imposed as official languages of the state. That's the tendency that has been there. But then what you see here is an underlying element of exclusion, language-based exclusion, because the speakers of the so-called minority languages have no place in the state. So you get a few people or many people disgruntled, left out on the basis of language. And sometimes they are subsumed under a particular group and given the impression that they belong here, when they don't. So those are the issues, some of the challenges, the lessons that we see from the past. These languages are very, very different, so diverse, and because of the differences in these languages, it will be hard then for us to have inter-ethnic communication or cross-cultural understanding because we speak different languages. Now, I want to bring here a concept, the concept of cross-border languages, what are called cross-border languages. Now, I'll give you one example. In much of West Africa, cutting to East Africa, there is the Fulani group of languages. That group of languages is spoken or cuts across 13 different boundaries, including Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Chad, Cameroon, Nigeria, Gambia, Senegal, Sudan, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and Central African Republic. Some of the languages in this cluster are known by these different names. One language is called Fula, Pula, Pule, Tuluko, Fulful. These languages are connected. They have what is known in linguistic terms, what is called mutual intelligibility. That is to say, when you speak one of these, and you cross over to a country where the other variety is spoken, you are not lost, as it were. We are not so different as we are made to believe we are in terms of the languages we speak. So, this is a resource in a transitional situation when we want to cultivate and build cross-cultural and inter-ethnic understanding. People should build on the kind of relationship or connections that exist across these languages. How do we make use of that as a resource and not as a source of division? Because if there is a group of people that feels marginalized, who speak particular languages and they feel marginalized, as I said earlier on, these people can be easily manipulated by bloodthirsty politicians, and then there appears that there are differences on language grounds, yet it's issues to do with quest for political power, issues to do with the desire to control the state, the desire to control resources. I don't think there is people speak one kind of a version of Nuer. I think people from different regions of the Nuer area would speak different versions with different, it was touched on earlier in the morning that some from up in the north would speak it differently in different ways. Language is a social matter. It's not an economic issue which you can talk about in terms of majority versus minority. It's a social thing. It's something that has to do with identity. It's something that has to do with who you are. So even if you are 2 or 3 people and you speak a language, you are so much attached to it. It's your language, it's your resource. And so we don't have to try and zero it in and look at it from an economic perspective, because it doesn't work that way. Development is first of all cultural, which implies linguistic too. And then it becomes economic and political. Wherever there is development, it has to show immediately in the aspects of people's everyday social and cultural life. Culture is the central location of answers to the challenges of underdevelopment. And since language is the main feature of culture in which all social and human activities are transacted, it constitutes an important ingredient to the development matrix. Languages are the very means of organizing everyday life in community serving as essential media for getting by, carrying out economic transactions and social functions. This means the knowledge economy calls for a social knowledge and a knowledge of economics based on language as a means of conceptualization and access, production and acquisition. In multilingual countries or countries that has more than one language, which is the norm, language policies can determine who has access to schools, who has access to opportunities for economic advancement, who participates in political decision, who has access to government services, and who gets treated fairly by government agencies. Language policies can determine who gets ahead and who gets left behind. Language policies affect the prospects for ethnic success, for ethnic groups, and for individuals in these groups. It was okay when there was fight for independence from British colonialism to have a nation-building program modeled around one or a few selected standardized national languages, such as Dinka, for instance, or Nuer in its standard form. However, what was true and useful yesterday is not necessarily true and applicable also to the current situation. What we need today is a nation-building agenda that is based on the principles of ethno-linguistic equality.
Nuer it lists as having about 750,000 speakers, which again is probably too low. And English, as I mentioned, is significant, at least in the south, many second language speakers. So what about the other 130 odd languages? What can we say about them? Well, many of them have small speaker populations. Many of these languages are very much minority languages. According to Ethnologue, there are 13 of those languages which have fewer than 1,000 speakers. We're talking about very small groups of people. And another 33 with fewer than 10,000 speakers. So, by and large, most of the languages spoken in Sudan have small numbers of speakers. They're not used over wide areas, they're not used by lots and lots of people, they're used in very small restricted areas, maybe a few villages, for one particular group. And out of the whole of Sudan as it's currently constituted, there are two areas of very high linguistic diversity. These are the areas where most of these languages are concentrated. One is the Nuba Mountains region, which is, I would say, the most linguistically diverse region of all, and the other, of course, is the south of the country. If we look at a map, first of the whole country, all I want you to see here is that there's a lot more text down the bottom than there is up the top. And if we move on to the next one, where we zoom in on the south, we can see there are lots of languages spoken in this area. Okay. Languages of wider communication. Now, Arabic is the official language, and it's been important, at least in the north, since the conversion to Islam, many hundreds of years ago. The impact of Arabic on the south is fairly limited. And English was the major colonial language in the south. As well as the north, Arabic became an official language after 1956 and was the main language of education, at least for a time. And clearly this is one of the bones of contention between the north and the south, or it's symbolic of the conflict between the north and the south. This was something that was imposed on people, at least up until the 1972 peace accord. Both in 1972 and 2005, making English usable in the south was an element of the peace accords. So this was something that people felt very deeply about. Reinforcing what Finex already said, language is crucial to people's identity. Most people in South Sudan are at least bilingual, if not multilingual. It's normal to grow up knowing several languages. Okay, what's happening now? Here I'm basing what I say on research by a scholar called Ketlahan. I can give a reference later if anybody needs it. He did research in the Upper Nile province. So this is an area where English is now officially important language. But he found that it's not being that widely used. Lots and lots of people said to him that they wanted to speak English, and lots of people thought that English was a wonderful language that they thought was very important, but not that many people actually used it. However, he did observe that major languages were becoming used more, and this was at the expense of small languages. And this is happening all across the world. And it's happening even in South Sudan. So there are really difficult problems here in formulating a language policy. And the ones that I'm going to talk about are first official language or official languages. How do you choose? What then is going to be the role of other languages? How are you going to deal with the problem of literacy? And how are you also going to deal with the problem of finding resources to support a policy? So firstly, if you think about official languages, it would seem clear to me that some kind of decision will need to be made in a state of South Sudan about what is an official language or official languages. I think that it will be necessary for a state to say, this language or these languages are the ones that the state is going to work with. However, as soon as you do that, it has implications. Official languages are very greedy. They take over resources, they grab things, and that's a problem. To sustain languages requires resources. To teach languages in schools requires resources. Official languages are always going to get first grab at the available resources in any situation. But language policy needs to think about that. Language policies need to take this into account and have some kind of idea about resource allocation. Even in a situation where there's more than one official language, resources may get stretched. In any case, what kind of resource allocation is going to be given for any other languages, non-official languages? Are they even going to get a look in? In some cases, and this is the case in Sudan, some languages will have resources available. For example, reading materials that were prepared by missionaries who used the language at some point. But in many cases, languages will have no written materials, no resources. Are they just going to be left to wither? These are important questions. Okay, when Timor-Leste became an independent state, the language policy questions they faced were very, very difficult. Portuguese was the colonial language, and as Finex has already mentioned, colonial languages often stand a good chance in these situations of being selected as an official language. However, Portuguese had never been used very widely in West Timor. It was used by an educated elite, it was used to some extent in religious purposes, but otherwise it was barely used. Nevertheless, for various reasons, some of the ones that Finex mentioned, some I think more political, it was selected as one of the official languages of the country. The other official language is Tetum. So Tetum is an indigenous language of Timor. However, at the time of independence, basically Tetum had no written culture. It had barely been written ever. And in the last 10 years, there's been a massive effort to try and address that problem, which has taken a huge, huge amount of work. Timor-Leste also uses Indonesian and English as working languages, and the case of Indonesian is very interesting here. Because Indonesia controlled East Timor from 1975 until 1999, there is in fact an entire generation in Timor-Leste who grew up educated in Indonesian. A huge proportion of the population find that a very comfortable language, much more comfortable certainly than Portuguese, and possibly for many of them more comfortable than Tetum. And I've heard research reports which suggest that there's some sense of disempowerment amongst at least some of those people. Timor-Leste also has around 15 indigenous languages spoken. Again, like the situation in South Sudan, many of these are tiny languages, many of them actually severely endangered, and they're getting very limited support from any official policy. South Sudan is an enormously linguistically complex place. If there is an independent state of South Sudan, if, as the theme of this conference suggests, people are going to be looking for paths out of conflict through dialogue, then I would suggest that having a language policy, a good language policy, is going to be an important part of the mix. It's going to be an important aid to social cohesion. It's going to allow social inclusion for the maximum number of people. And in developing such policy, which I am sure is going to be extremely difficult, I don't think this is a simple problem at all, but I think that some crucial factors which will need to be balanced will be looking at prevailing patterns of language use, trying not to make people feel that what they're comfortable with, what they're used to, is now forbidden. Making as many people as possible feel that there's continuity. I think that another factor which will need to be balanced is respect for all the languages that are spoken in the area. As I said, it's now widely held that access to your native tongue is a human right, and it would be, to pick up another of Finex's points, in some sense it's undemocratic to stop people from using those languages, even if it's just neglect that means that they die out. And the other very important factor which will need to be balanced in with these others is what resources will be available and how should they be allocated in support of different languages, in support of different aspects of the policy.